Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Thank you for joining. So my name is Josh. If you haven't met me before, I am the children's book author for Zoe and Zach's Pain Hacks, all these 5 books. I am a senior lecturer in physiotherapy, and my PhD was on how children think about pain. And tonight I'm going to share some of that research and also, since the last few years, where are things heading and what has been done from a science point of view, and then how does that relate to the children's books. So let's jump in and get started with this third webinar in the series. So this is the busiest slide, and you don't need to comprehend it all, but basically I've just gone through and found all the studies that have some sort of pain science education intervention, and there's 15 of them. One was in 2008, and it's about tonsillectomy, but then all the rest are since 2018. And so I guess the first thing to think about is this is a very fast and rapid and new field to look at. So the evidence for pain science education in kids is new. The second thing to point out is there's no intervention studies looking at children's books yet in that column. Thirdly, a lot of the outcome measures that are used in these studies, it was prior to the development of the tool in my PhD, the copy. And so what gets assessed as the outcome, it says things like, oh, they increase knowledge. But what was used is it's kind of like a memory test, almost like a quiz. And is that long-term conceptual change, or is that just a short-term memory kind of test? And so that's a challenge in the literature, is this long-term follow-up. Number 4, we also need to look at behavior change. So not just did it help them think differently, but did it help the kids behave differently? So is there less disability, and what's their pain levels like down the track? Things like that. Fifth point to talk about is that there aren't any prevention studies just yet looking at getting a cohort of children at a school or somewhere and following them over a long period of time and then intervening and seeing if the prevalence of pain changes. Well, and the incidence as well. And lastly, that point at the bottom, many other studies, by the way, if you can't read the slides, I'm happy to share them with you. Just email me, I can send them. There's lots of other studies beyond intervention studies that are being done. So there's studies on like psychological interventions like CBT that include this as an intervention. There's research on teachers and parents and other significant influencers. There's cohort studies, there's qualitative studies. We'll save all those for another time, but I just wanted to share a bunch of links. If you're interested, I've put the references at the end. You can grab those from me via slide. I can email the slides to you if you want to dive deep and get into the nitty gritty. But I thought it'd be first really helpful to come up with some clear definitions of what we're talking about. So for conceptual change to occur, what's the concept that we're talking about? And so we've got the concept of pain. And so that involves beliefs and knowledge about the what, why, and how of pain. What is pain? How does it exist? How does it work? How do you feel it? Why does it exist? Why do you feel it? So that's the what, why, and how. And you can see here, this is in the third book of Zoe and Zach's Pain Hacks. You can see that's kind of the face that you see when someone reconceptualizes pain. So Zoe's teacher is saying, so when you accidentally fell and your knee started to bleed, at least 7 messages were sent or received. And Zoe's there like, oh, well, all of this happened in a split second. And so she's reconceptualizing the way that how pain is experienced. Does that make sense? And so there's so much, and someone's concept of pain can change in so many different ways that it's hard to measure. And so that was the goal of my PhD. Now, kids are calling out for increased awareness and understanding. So the research that we're doing is kind of being demanded, and it's much needed. And I think it's probably needed even more than it's being demanded. So here's a quote from a kid in a recent study that just was published recently by Brown et al. And this child said, more people need to understand that chronic pain actually exists. Like, it's not just in your head, a made up kind of thing. Like, I've had teachers just saying that I'm pretending, that they don't believe in chronic pain. So maybe just getting more awareness. And I think that's one of the things that these children's books do, is create awareness. Now, in my PhD, I interviewed a whole range of children aged 8 through to 12. And I asked them at the very start of the interview, draw whatever the word pain makes you think. You can do this now if you'd like. I'd be really interested if you send it to me online somehow or email me your drawing. But what would you draw? And have a think about that. And when we ask kids to draw it, kids who hadn't had chronic pain, they just exclusively drew an injury. So you might have drawn that too. Maybe a knee bleeding or a broken bone, something like that. Now, kids who had chronic pain in that group, they also did draw injuries, but it was definitely more prominent to see some sort of emotional element in their drawing. A sad face, tears, a broken heart, all those kinds of things. Now, this study was just small and qualitative, so we don't have the data to say this is always the case, but it was really fascinating that every child who had chronic pain did this and every child who didn't did that. And so I think what's that teaching us is that someone's concept of pain is kind of dynamic and experience-based. So based on the experiences that you have and you observe, you develop what your way of thinking about what pain is. So from that study, we interviewed a whole range of kids and we came up with this conceptual framework where the concept of pain that we've been talking about, that defined word, is a bit like a puddle. Like it's a mix of stuff. We don't really know what's in the puddle, but it's there. You can kind of see it. And it's made up of lots of different raindrops. Some have labels, some don't. Some don't have labels because we don't know what's in them. But the big ones that we saw in this study were pain in me, my pain-related knowledge, and pain in the world around me. So if you think about so that's personal experience, that's personal knowledge, and that's contextual kind of observations. And then what comes out of the puddle when you jump in it is you communicate that. And so maybe there's some parents listening and you're thinking, how can I help my child? Often it's in that communication stage and it's validating and exploring their experiences early in the process rather than waiting until you're 2 years down the track and they've had pain for a really long time. Sometimes it's potentially helpful to do this sort of work. So this was a really early study, and one of the main reasons we did that was to get the language and the words that kids use, because we wanted to develop a questionnaire. And now, so that data went into the item development, and we got expert data as well. And then we ran a whole bunch of psychometric analyses on the data. We piloted on kids. We got the items evaluated by kids again, and then through experts. And then we did another series of interviews, and then we ran a big study, a validation study, 124 kids or something like that. It was an online survey, and we collected even more data, and then you analyze it and you see how the data fits together, which items should stay in, which items should get removed. And then basically we ended up with this 14-item tool. And one of the advantages of this tool is it's not just a knowledge quiz like I was talking about. It's an agreement scale. So there's 5 points. You can strongly disagree, be unsure, agree, or strongly agree. And you'll get a score based on how you respond to each of the 14 sentences. And so it's not about necessarily being right. It's more about you conveying what you're up to. And so the child might say, I'm unsure. And that's a great answer, because then you can sit beside them and say, hey, why do you tick unsure? And it creates this really nice conversation where the child's using their language. The simple language of the questionnaire is nice, and that's been kind of ticked off in a lot of different papers since it came out. And that it's brief is also helpful. So if you are watching on a second screen and multitasking with your phone, you can scan that QR code, or you can go to this URL, copy.joshuawpate.com, and it'll have an online version of the tool. Or I can email you a printable version, or you can access it in the journal article that it's been published in. But this is what the printable version looks like. And a lot of clinics are now using this. And I think one of the parts, the most common feedback I get is that it helps to start the conversation. So you could say, imagine this is like, I think this was a 12-year-old girl named Nora. And we said like, oh, so Nora, why did you tick disagree that you can feel a lot of pain even when an injury is small? And straight away, you're getting to that point, like she's given you something just in the means of a tick, and then you get to give it back in terms of language. And then so you're getting this really nice interaction, and it's much less confrontational than if you didn't have that and you say, all right, Nora, tell me, why do you think you can have pain without damage, or damage without pain? That can be really confronting for someone. So there's been a whole bunch of work on this tool since it initially was developed, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. It'll keep getting improved. There's an adult version, lots of different languages. There's teams all around the world working on this stuff, and it's very, very exciting. But there's also some kind of other avenues where this work is fitting in. And we wrote a paper last year, Emma Reel in Belgium led this, and it was on cancer pain. And so if you think about pain doesn't always mean damage. Giving that message to a child who has cancer pain, it needs a lot more nuance, right? Because there's a fear of recurrence. Oh, that pain might mean that the cancer's back, and that could mean really serious consequences. Unlike non-specific pains or a whole range of different pains where the prognosis is much better. So we wrote about that in that paper, and we're starting to think about it. The second point is in the third book in the series. It's not necessarily just pain. Pain is one of our autonomic nervous system responses to keep us safe and protect us. But there's others like nausea and fatigue, anxiety, a whole bunch of different ones. And that book is intentionally set up to raise those conversations and get the conversation started rather than people bottling up these symptoms and emotions and not reporting them. And then it leads to worse outcomes down the track. That's our thinking anyway. And then this third point is about preventative education. And Kelly Ickmans and the team over there recently wrote a paper about preventative education. I think it's great, and that's where all my work's heading. And I think it's really, really fascinating to think about how a child who doesn't have pain could benefit from hearing the information in these books, because it would reduce stigma. They could be a better friend potentially. It might prevent their pain. We don't know yet. And the fact of the matter is, it really excites me as a researcher that there is a resource now that we can start testing. So this is going to be a really cool few years ahead. And I hope if you know kids or if you know anyone around who might benefit, that you share these books with them. That would be fantastic. Knowledge translation takes time. And I just wanted to point this out from a research perspective. Often we have some findings and then you want to get it out to everyone. These books, for instance, took 5 years, like around that time. So we had What Works for Adults, and that had been around for about 15 years at the time when I started thinking about some of this work, and I was already into my PhD. We had some papers like What's the Best Evidence for Kids, and it was saying we need pain science education. There was evidence about prognostic factors, and there's all these gaps about education. We've got children's books. There's quotes that they're a really nice way to learn. There's good evidence about relatable social stories where a child relates to the main character. One thing I love, and a lot of people are saying, I'm getting all these emails about, you can tangibly hold it in your hands. There's something about that compared to an ebook that's really nice. It can provide an anchor to your education. So for clinicians who are listening and who are providing the same kinds of education or maybe telling similar anecdotes to lots of patients, it can provide that anchor so you can come back. Oh, remember how we talked about Zoe Zoppins had that adventure and Zach Zoppins did this or whatever. And it just becomes this conversation point. It's a bit more accessible than confronting head on. It plants seeds for the future. Oh, so Zach did graded exposure and pacing and then Zoe did it. And have you thought about changing? You can keep coming back. And this was one really nice outcome from a recent study we did. I haven't published this yet. We're writing it up. But children were given a video reading of the first book or draft version of it, and then they were given a draft version of the book. And the number of times viewed, I think it was 4 times bigger. It was like kids were reading the book several times a week, whereas they were only watching the video once, and that was on average. So it was nice to see kids were saying, oh, you can keep coming back to it. I wanted to keep reading it. I couldn't believe there was new things each time I saw it. I didn't realize that there were dogs hidden and lots of fun stuff as they go through. We've had a huge number of rounds of feedback, and that takes a long time, and so that contributes to the 5 years. I was really pedantic about keeping it as one key message per book and not trying to jam-pack it all into one book, because I think the messages do stand alone to some extent, but they complement each other. The cartoon style took a long time to develop, and it's action-oriented. There's always stuff happening. It makes kids want to turn the pages, get excited. There's diary entries, which is relatable for the 10, 11, 12-year-olds. But also, I think, interestingly, there's some research with teens who are looking at this, and it's like putting in that empowering position of going, hey, what do you think if a child was to read this, like an 8-year-old, what do you think they'd understand it? And kind of giving them that empowering question to battle, to think about. Now, not only, I mentioned earlier, it's a relatable social story, but in book 4 and 5, we see success stories, and they're really powerful in seeing a child have a turning point. And we've got the free online portal. It's got printable activities, videos, heaps of links and text, and great stuff that can be useful, not just in a classroom or just in a clinic or just at home. There's lots of stuff for everywhere, which is really cool. And all of this is based on the latest research. So in a 5-year period, a lot of evidence is changing, and so constantly updating and changing things. So that's very, very exciting. And I think this idea in the research of knowledge translation is a challenge. And it's one, there's a bunch of pediatric pain teams in Canada who do this great as well. And it's great to be a part of this growing kind of community of researchers working on doing a good job at this. So where we ended up with is a series of 5 children's books about the science of pain. So there's 4 kind of targets if you have a look at the targeted education. So when you finish the book, it has more activities for the kids. It has some questions for the parents to consider. On the online platform, there's stuff for clinicians and teachers. So it's very kid focused, but then it's also relevant for the adults who are influential and supportive around them. There's the 5 main messages. I'm going to talk about those in a second. We're currently analysing the data that I just mentioned, comparing book 1 to sham education. And this is something none of those previous studies had done, is have a sham control group. And we know in research, like, so for instance, there's a bunch of studies I could share, but a slap lesion in your shoulder, it makes a lot of sense that a surgery would fix that lesion, right? But it wasn't until very recently in the Lancet, like one of the best journals in the world, a randomized controlled trial with a sham, so a sham surgery, that study was done. And what was really interesting is that the surgery was no more effective than the sham surgery. So they opened them up, didn't do anything, closed them up, said you've had the surgery, and the outcomes were similar, and conservative care was better. And just a bizarre kind of study. And so for us to kind of concretely prove as a researcher that this education is better than fake education, we had to make a book that had rhyming, really cool pictures, but we didn't want it to teach anything meaningful about pain science education. So this book just taught kids how to rate pain out of 10. And it was interesting because we interviewed the kids before and after each book, after they read the 2 different books, and we got them to kind of talk about what did they learn from the book. And the insights that came from the real book were much deeper and more reflective. Whereas the second book, the sham book that was given first, actually, in that book, kids were like, oh yeah, I just learned how to rate it out of 10. I kind of already knew that would be more pain if you had a baby than if you tripped on a rock or something. And so, yeah, the idea of being able to test really rigorously is very appealing to me as a researcher. I don't want the research I'm doing to just fade away in 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 years. Ideally, we do really good research that lasts the test of time. So I think, yeah, this idea of testing it preventatively is a big one, and that's kind of where we're going to head. So I mentioned there's some learning outcomes for each of the books, and if you look at Haley Leake's work, in 2021, there was a study in adults, and they gathered what do patients value about pain, and they surveyed, and they found out what's most relevant, and they came up with these 3 things. Pain doesn't mean my body's damaged. Thoughts, emotions, and experience affect pain, and I can retrain my overprotective pain system. Now, that's all adult language, right? There was a more recent study also in adults, and they came up with key learning statements. So they went back and forward between experts and patients. And I've color-coded them because actually each of these things map onto the 5 different books really nicely. I will point out number 8, all pain is real no matter what's causing it, is part of the online portal because it's a bit beyond the scope of a 6 to 10-year-old confronting that idea of real, because it got really confusing in the interviews that we did in the research. So this is this constant process of being evidence-based and really rigorous. But doing that and spending these years on doing this research is meaning that it's going to now, it has a place, like it belongs in the office of every pediatrician and every clinic around the world now. I really believe that it can help so many people. And so, for example, if we look at thoughts, emotions, and experiences affect pain, that's similar to the kid version, which we came up with of so many things turn the volume of my pain up and down. Or in this study, it said when it comes to pain, everything matters. And so you can see how we've made the language kid first and appropriate for a young child. And then the story that conveys that is that red and blue light study. And then Zoe thinks about her own experiences in the playground and a whole lot of relatable experiences to try and convey this message and start generating lots of conversations. I mentioned a SCED study. I won't go into too much of the details, but I just wanted to point out So this is one particular item from the questionnaire. The brain processes lots of details before you feel pain. So you can strongly agree, unsure, disagree, strongly disagree. And we got 9 measurements from a bunch of kids of what they thought. And so you could follow one of the colors and see how it changes over time. There was a lot of variability, and this study wasn't huge. But one of the things that it's really opened up and started making us think is even the act of filling out the questionnaire is causing self-reflection. And then you're giving them the book, and then that's causing more reflection and more conceptual change. And then they fill out the questionnaire again, and then they're interviewed and they start piecing it together and they talk to their parents. And so concept of pain, what I was talking about right at the start, is a very dynamic construct. And it always seems to kind of be varying a bit more than what we see in adult data. Now, I also must say, because what we're expecting when the real book came, that we would just see a big shift, everyone would agree. That was kind of the anticipation. But what's fascinating is in the real book in that study was an early draft version. And a lot of the feedback from this study has made the book a lot better. So we need to do more research and go at it again, because now some of the needs, like making it more interactive and really clear and drive home the main point, and some of these things weren't achieved in this early draft version. And so I'm really excited about the next studies that are coming out. It's going to be cool. And if you're a researcher listening and you want to be involved, I'd love to connect you. I obviously have a conflict of interest, so I'm going to help connect people, but I don't want to necessarily be involved in the study. But I'm excited that these books are being rigorously tested and ongoingly improved, which is going to be awesome. Now, I want to introduce you as well to one of my PhD students, Beck Fechner. She's not here tonight, but I'm sure you'll meet her at some point. She's a brilliant researcher and clinician. She was in Queensland, Australia. Her first PhD paper was just published actually last week, and it was about teachers thinking about their students' pain. So do they think that their students' pain is real or not, and how do they go about it, and kind of tackling that issue of, but I'm not a doctor, some of that stuff. So that paper is out, and we're thinking really hard about that. And from that survey, we've now done a big series of qualitative interviews with teachers and trying to understand the language that gets used in an education setting about pain, because health professionals have kind of their own vocabulary, and we want to bridge the gap between the health and education sectors. And we think these books are a helpful way to get started with that, but a lot of research needs to be done just understanding the differences between the language. And then this year as well, a big RCT pilot study is being rolled out. So it's early days, and we're just trialing a feasibility test of how this will look in a whole range of schools. But basically giving teachers pain science education, giving them a potential framework to consider about danger and safety and how it relates to pain in the classroom, and then seeing how they run with it. They could run it as an excursion, as an assignment, as a term, as a part of their curriculum, in the playground, whatever they want. And we're going to document and see how different schools approach that, and look at what potential options there are to deliver pain science education via the teachers, because all this stuff maps really nicely into all the modern curriculums around the world for schools. So we're really excited about that too. So yeah, keep an eye on Beck Fechner's work. Now, I want you to imagine, like, down the track, hopefully soon, but it does take time to change school curriculums. I can imagine a school curriculum changing, and maybe schools would start teaching about pain and might say things like that second book. Many things can turn the volume of pain up or down. Now, in an adult world, we have a diagram like this. This is brilliant work from Hodges' team. And it just shows all these different lines and dots of things that contribute to someone's experience of pain. And the kid-friendly version is in book 2, and it carries through all of the different books, actually, where we think about like what you can see, what you fear, what you feel, what you think, what you expect, where you are, what you remember, what you understand, your movements, all of these contributors to an experience. And we apply that kind of like a brain map for each moment and each kind of pain that the child can comprehend and think about. So there's so much work to do. I hope that's been really clear. But yeah, I guess some of these questions in my brain are, what are the learning outcomes that lead to the best clinical outcomes in kids? And so maybe it's a matter of, we should start with this book, or we should focus on this, or those kind of questions will get answered in the future, which is exciting. And then how do we test and possibly implement change in clinics, in schools, in curriculums, in policy, in the media, and globally, not just in some jurisdictions. So that's really exciting for me. But all of this requires a lot of time, which we do have some time, I think, where there's a lot of young researchers out there, which is exciting. But it also requires money, and we don't have that. So watch this space, and if you know funders, let me know. That'd be brilliant. It's always good. If you are interested in diving deeper and looking more into the research, there is an exhaustive list of references on the online portal. So go to zoeandzackspainhacks.com, click through, find out based on each book what you want to read. And if you're a parent or a teacher, you can also jump on there. There's videos and there's a whole bunch of stuff that is not just health professional jargon. There's whole sections for you. So I hope that is a really useful resource as well. I'm speaking to teacher librarians later this week, and there's been a range of them contact me about how they can function. So they would be reading the kids kind of in an academic sense, they would be reading to a classroom, but how do they then facilitate these kind of questions and explore contributors to pain, and there's lots of things like that. So if you're sitting here and you've got a question you want to talk about in the Q&A, you can pop it in. Now's a great time. These are the references from that first slide that I mentioned. The children's books, so since I think the last time I spoke, they're also now available in the UK. So there's an Australian distributor, US, Europe, and the UK. The US one also goes to Canada, from my understanding. So yeah, they're now available. Let people know, that would be brilliant. And I want to say a big thank you again. All these people are just wonderful. The expert reviewers, the NOI team, all the families and the schools who are participating, my family, my PhD students. There's this whole team of a large number of people. And yeah, it would be nice if we could acknowledge all of them. So next week, we have the 4th webinar in this series of 4 webinars, and we're going to talk about, from a kid's perspective, what they're thinking of the books and how they conceptualize pain. It's going to be lots of fun, and I want you to invite kids that you know, if they're staying up to 8 p.m. in Australian Eastern Standard Time, Daylight Savings Time, let them know, or they can watch the recording. It's going to be fun to have them in the Q&A. I'm always keen to keep the discussion going, so please feel free to contact me on social media or email with questions, feedback, suggestions, ideas. That is an amazing part of the internet, is that we can have a constant dialogue going. So it is time for the Q&A. Thank you very much for joining tonight. It has been a blast, as always. I will give you a moment if you wanted to type some questions. There has been a number of questions again during the week. A lot of them have been around getting, how do I get it to my local library, and some of those kind of practical questions. And so if you have more of those questions, I think it is different in different parts of the world. And so let me know and I can try and help. And the publishers are also brilliant. NOI Group team are fantastic. So trying to get that to roll out just does take time, and it will build traction. And then the other question I've had is from clinicians who want to advocate and share about this work in schools and in the gyms they work at or wherever they work. And that's great. And I think that's a really nice thing to consider, and I'm really appreciative of that. For clinics who are buying bulk series, contact the publishers. I think there are discounts if you buy lots of them, and because there's people who are each patients buying them and stuff like that. So there's an ongoing, a lot of clinics sell books to patients, and some patients they prefer to buy it via their clinician. And so that's also possible. You can email me or NOI Group and sort that out. They make life very easy, which is fantastic. Yeah, so there were 2 that come to mind. I'll have a look at the chat, and we'll go there next. We are rapidly running out of time, so I'll jump in. The question says, do you know of any cohort studies happening at the moment that have measured any of these pain education learning outcomes and then the prevalence incidence of persistent pain? I do. I am involved kind of as an external stakeholder in a study that's being set up in Switzerland, doing exactly that. So measuring prevalence and incidence, intervening, and then measuring it again. I think it's going to be a game-changing study in a lot of ways, because we just don't know a whole lot. So the prevalence of kids' pain kind of increases throughout childhood and adolescence, and to get to about that 1 in 5. But studies vary a lot in how they measure that. So would you consider a 5-minute headache once a week recurrent pain, or does it have to be constant pain, and what types of pain, and how did you diagnose it? Lots of questions come up in the definition. And so that means that there's variability. And I think the latest review said something like 11 to 54% of kids have some sort of challenge from chronic pain throughout childhood or adolescence. And so the sheer number of kids in the world who this is relevant for and then potentially really helpful for is just massive. And then even the kids who don't have it could benefit. And I know for me personally, now that all the stuff I know about pain science and what we've put into these books, I wish that the younger me had this information, because it would have made me a more empathetic person, that's for sure. I hope that answers that particular question. I am wary. I've taken up half an hour of your time, so I'm going to leave it there. But do email me, reach out if you've got questions. My email address is there. You can contact me on social media, however you want. And we will be in touch, and we will have the kids webinar next week, the 4th one, to launch these books. So thank you again for joining, and see you next week. Bye.